We all rely on farmers and ranchers, but farming is riskier than other businesses out there. Crop insurance helps farmers manage their risk. With crop insurance, farmers put skin in the game by paying premiums and shouldering deductibles. That keeps taxpayers from having to pick up the whole bill every time disaster strikes. Today, about 90% of U.S. farmland is insured, providing $100 billion in protection to more than 130 different kinds of crops. It's a testament to the program's success.
Thank you for joining us for our Agri-Pulse Washington Week in Review. I'm Spencer Chase, joined as always by Agri-Pulse's Phil Brasher, as well as this week by Virginia Democrat Abigail Spanberger. And Congresswoman Spanberger, I appreciate you taking the time to join us for a conversation on some things we saw this week, as well as some things we might see the next couple of weeks, really. And the latter part is something I want to ask you about, something that we're expecting to see coming out of the Senate is a response to the House HEROES Act and the Senate taking up its own coronavirus aid bill here before Congress heads on recess in the month of August. So considering that the House has already passed its version of coronavirus relief, that bill contained a lot of provisions for food and agriculture policy, specifically some relief for producers. I'm wondering what you're going to want to see both from the Senate bill as well as whatever final aid package might end up passing, what you're hoping to see that will lead you to lend your support to it.
So what I'm looking for in this next relief package is a focus on bringing relief to American workers, American families, and the small business and employers across our country that need it. And specifically, among the things that I think should be priorities will be relief funding to state and localities. I represent many rural communities, a total of 10 counties, and many of them rural, that while they have been very fiscally responsible in planning for a rainy day, they could never have planned for what is essentially a tsunami. And support to our state and local, particularly our smaller communities, is incredibly important to the district that I represent. And this is a bipartisan issue. I led an effort in the House about 2 months ago, pulling together more than 100 members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, advocating for this form of relief. So that's a priority for me. And I think we also need to recognize that we are on a difficult trajectory as we continue to rebuild our economy, get people back to work in a way that is safe, which really requires that we continue to have a focus on testing and contact tracing. So there are many components that I think we should be looking at, but the plan towards the future is one that I definitely want to see federal support to that, and then for our community in particular, support to our localities and our smaller counties.
Congresswoman, I wanted to ask you about the climate issue. That's something that you've been involved in. Obviously, Democrats have talked a lot about it. Vice President Biden this week came out with the expansion of his environmental proposals with a fairly significant section on agriculture and its role in that issue. The National Corn Growers Association this week adopted a whole set of new proposals around climate, said things like USDA must have the lead role when it comes to agriculture and climate, and also that the farmers have to get credit for things that they're already doing as well as additional practices. What can you say to farmers that may be a little nervous about regulation, impact on energy prices, the government getting involved in this climate issue?
Well, I think that many of your viewers and listeners and supporters recognize that farmers and producers are in fact the original conservationists. If your soil isn't healthy, if your water isn't healthy, there's an impact on what you're producing. And so what I love about my role in the Agriculture Committee as chair of Conservation and Forestry is that we are really bridging some of the conversations related to the environment and climate and conservation and what's already happening on our farms across the country. In Virginia, we see really amazing producers who are utilizing rotational grazing practices that are great for the animals that they're raising. It's good for their bottom line. And it's also really good to ensure that those grasses grow a little bit more, grow a root system, and it's good for the land, it's good for soil health, it's good for carbon sequestration. So when we're having conversations about we want to get to net zero carbon emissions, that's fantastic. But what elements of our community are going to be a part of that discussion? And for me, it has to include our farmers, producers, and foresters. So for anyone who's a little bit, trepidatious about where this conversation's going, I think it's incredibly important that farmers and producers in agriculture have a seat at the table. There's been some conversations and some colleagues who want to make it out like agriculture's the problem, but in fact, agriculture can be part of the solution. And between precision agriculture practices, rotational grazing of animals, a real focus on the use of cover crops, using technology to ensure that producers and farmers are utilizing the correct amount of water or the correct amount of fertilizer, all of these things, these are pro-environmental policies. Our committee also focuses on it's conservation and forestry. And so I recently had conversations with the head of the Forest Service talking about, how are our national forests and how are our forest lands impacted by extreme weather events. There's some real impacts that we're feeling across our country because of the impact of extreme weather events and challenges to climate. And so bringing our agricultural community to that discussion table, I think, is an excellent next step. And so that's why I'm proud in the House to be leading the Growing Climate Solutions Act, because we're really attempting to do just that, bridge that discussion about how do we address climate change, get to net carbon zero emissions, but also ensure that there's a place for agriculture at that table.
Ask you about another environmental issue. The president this week announced a major new policy change that basically will speed up environmental reviews, limit the number of reviews that are required, has support from agriculture. Earlier, of course, the president replaced the Waters of the U.S. Rule that basically narrowed the definition of what falls under the Clean Water Act, wetlands and streams and so forth. What do you say to farmers who may be concerned that a Democratic Congress, a Democratic White House may try to roll back those changes, which are pretty popular with a lot of farm groups and a lot of farmers around the country? That Waters of the U.S. rule we heard about all the time.
Well,
I bet you did too.
I would make the comment that the conversations about what sort of standards we should be setting, that's a conversation that needs to be had. There will always be areas of disagreement, but at the end of the day, if we are focused on ensuring that our farmers can have the ability to, exercise their livelihood and grow a good crop, while also protecting our land, that is a level of cooperation we can achieve. And I, as a Virginian, look no further than what we've been able to do here within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Our farmers and producers have really worked hard and changed some of their practices over the past decade, and the results have been positive. We have improved the health of the Chesapeake Bay, and so the kind of economic impact that has on our fisheries and on our wildlife has been tremendous, but it's also been a great partnership within agriculture for those who have improved upon their own practices. I think as it relates, having spent a fair amount of time with some of our cattle producers in the district, listening to cattle producers talk about the experience of shifting to rotational grazing practices for the purposes of, keeping water and streams clean, keeping cattle out of the streams, fighting against some of the erosion that occurs when they are in and out of the streams. The benefits that have actually come to those producers when they've employed those practices have been significant in terms of the ease of caring for them. They pretty much always know which paddock their cattle's in. But in addition to that, the health of the soil, the health of the grass, and then the type of product that they are producing. At this point, it's grazing cattle that's that is grass fed, and that has an impact when they go to sell that meat and that animal later down the line.
Well, these particular rules that I mentioned, the NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act rule, and the Waters of the U.S. rule, did the administration go too far, you think?
I think that, I don't want to say that the administration went too far necessarily, but I do think that when it comes to policies that are going to impact essentially the livelihood of farmers and producers, it is much more important, I would make the argument, to make any proposed changes, be it tightening of regulations or loosening of regulations within Congress, because when the president takes action, it can create a bit of a volley, and the role of Congress should be to create the standards that are being followed and making them stable, so that our farmers and producers don't necessarily have the worry that you mentioned earlier, which is that there might be changes administration to administration. So I'm not necessarily pleased with the steps that the president has taken, but outside of the changes that he's made, I think it actually long-term impacts the stability of kind of standards and expectations that those who have to abide by those regulations, it creates an instability there that I think is not helpful.
I want to wrap up talking about a subject that you have worked on, and a lot of other folks on Capitol Hill, as well as a lot of farm groups have talked about, and that's the issue of rural broadband. We saw the House Appropriations Committee consider language and clear language to provide just shy of $1 billion to the issue. It's going to be coming across the House floor here this next week. We've seen previous, the Reconnect program was created in a budget deal. We've seen other appropriations pushes add more funding to rural broadband. We've also seen some standalone legislation introduced by a number of your colleagues in the House that would provide far more funding to that. I'm wondering, what's it going to take in your mind, both as someone who has worked on this issue as a policymaker and as someone who votes on how this money is spent? What do you think it's going to take, both from a policy and a spending perspective, to really put a dent in this issue and move it to where it's not so much a lobbying point and something that folks work on, but in change potentially a success story instead?
Yeah. Well, Spencer, the district I represent is 10 counties, 7 of them are wholly rural, 3 more suburban. And so in my district alone, I have seen a bit of the disconnect where I represent communities where there is no access to internet. And just over the county line, anybody who wants to get a connection can get a connection. And so I will have town halls where I talk about broadband, and half the room doesn't know why it's an issue, and half the room is saying, oh my gosh, this is what we need. And that conversation is happening not just in my district, it's everywhere. Because districts, particularly more suburban or more urban districts, where the issue of access becomes whether or not you have a computer or whether or not you pay to connect. It isn't an issue of whether or not you literally can actually get that internet, no matter how much you're willing to pay. In recent months, because of COVID-19 and the tragedy that is this pandemic, there has been such a focus on the necessity of internet. And I think for some communities where connectivity was a given, people forget and maybe don't realize just how much it's a required part of our lives, the way electricity was 100 years ago. And so I think that from a policy standpoint, there's those of us who have been kind of beating the drum of the fact that this is an infrastructure requirement across the country. We need broadband connectivity coast to coast. And in an agriculture hearing discussion with Secretary Perdue, he said, yes, we needed coast to coast. So this is actually an area of broad bipartisan agreement for those who are aware of the issue. And so I am hopeful that we'll be able to make more progress, because in recent months, the pandemic has laid bare just how necessary internet is to our seniors, to our veterans, to those who are ill and need access to telehealth, of course, to our students. But at home in our district, I've visited a particular dairy farm where the internet connectivity is so bad that the farmers are employing real tremendous technology, but they can't always make use of what they're buying because they don't have internet access. And we've got producers who are buying precision agricultural technology, but they can't necessarily use it, or they need to have someone drive 10 hours to come and update the programs on their machinery because they can't just ping to the internet. And I think we finally reached a place where the business requirement of internet is so clearly understood in perhaps a way that it wasn't even 4 or 5 months ago, that when those of us who make an argument that this is infrastructure as necessary to the future of our economy as electricity and roads, I think now that argument is breaking through because so many people are working from home. And as we face record unemployment and real challenges to our economy, we need to be looking at what investments can we make that will help us build out of this. And so I think that's why there is a greater willingness at this point to view broadband internet connectivity as an infrastructure issue, and the interest and the willingness to look at various different policy solutions, be it a full-scale internet coast-to-coast bill or some of these larger piecemeal adjustments that address the needs in particular communities. I think there's a willingness to discuss these like that we've never seen, at least not in the short time I've been in Congress.
So we are just around the corner from a busy couple of weeks in Washington, certainly the busiest couple of weeks that we've seen in the last few months, as we've seen Capitol Hill sort of grind to a halt here due to the coronavirus pandemic, as has many other facets of the country. But Congresswoman Spanberger, we appreciate you stopping by to talk to us a little bit about some of the news we saw this last week, as well as what we might see here these next couple of weeks.
Thank you so much, Spencer. Thank you, Phil. Thank you for having me on. And I look forward, you'll be hearing a lot more about our Growing Climate Change Solutions Act. So hope to have a chance to speak with you as that one progresses through on the Senate side and the House side in the future.
Okay. Very good. Well, for Phil Brasher and Congresswoman Abigail Spanberger, I'm Spencer Chase. Have a good one.